I had some questions recently about fantasy races in my world. And I thought that was kind of an interesting topic, something that several different people have asked about over time. And I think it's a good thing to chat about because there's a couple of things that have come up. One is, what are the fantasy races that exist in my fantasy world? And the other, which I think is a little bit more interesting, is what do the interactions between these fantasy races look like in my world? Because that would be a very strange and interesting thing to start processing. We see a lot of fantasy races interact in interesting ways in the media that we see, but we don't really have this in our own world. Yes, obviously, we have different races of human being if you want to look at it that way, and we obviously have a pretty complicated past with how we as a people group have handled those situations. Yet we don't have people walking around that have four limbs, and we don't have a fish-like species that, we have to accommodate for in our cities. So it does seem like it would be a little bit different and interesting to process what that might look like in a fantasy world. So I think I'll start with what the fantasy races look like in my world, and not necessarily physically, though I'll describe that a little bit, but more culturally, how they're different. And then I will go into talking about how some of them interact. I'll probably be a little rambly with it, as I normally am. And as I'm working through these things, I'm going to be working on these guys and coloring them in, but I'll probably be flipping around through the sketchbook at different points as well, and kind of showing some portions that actually talk about or show some of the other races in my world. I haven't worked with all four of the main mortal races, but that's getting a little ahead of myself. So if you like this kind of content, I would encourage you to like and subscribe and stay tuned for more. I don't mention this often, but it is beneficial. So I'm going to start mentioning it a little bit more frequently, but I'll try not to spend too much time on it. We're going to go ahead and zoom in here. So right off the bat, I think what I have to talk about is kind of the hierarchical structure of races in my world. My world was designed by an omnipotent, omniscient creator being who very quickly brought into being several, actually I think it's 13 or 15 others to help him in his duties. Very similar to how Tolkien envisioned the Valar and all of the Maiar and all these other beings that helped him kind of manage creation in, with Eru Luvatar and whatnot. But in pretty quick order, other sentient races are created. You've got the elemental beings that are created pretty early on. They don't have flesh. They are just beings of soul. And that goes rather intriguingly. And there's a war between the two factions there. And essentially what happens from that is that the spheres are created, which is the different planes of existence on my planet. So you had originally all of these planes that kind of overlap one another, and after that, the god of time and of space, they come down and they manipulate things. So you have a sphere where time passes insanely fast. You have another realm where time does not move really at all. And then you have another, which is the material plane. And so you've got the beings of element that are confined to the realm of time moving quickly. You have the beings of concept who are placed in the arena where time does not move because they decay incredibly quickly when they're exposed to time. And then the material plane is obviously the one that, mortal beings exist on. Then later on, a couple of the creator deities get ahead of themselves and manage to create a race of sentient beings outside the design of the creator. And this, of course, does not go well. And they end up having a group of, I think, 7,000 of these gigantic, behemoths, amazingly powerful creatures that rebel against the gods, because, of course, that's what happens. And this actually ends up being something of cataclysmic proportions, where one of the creator deities has to actually destroy one of the moons that is surrounding this planet and then uses it to create a covering to embed these powerful beings beneath the surface of the planet, which of course is not going to come back to bite anyone in the backside later. And essentially this means that the planet is also a semi-hollow Earth kind of thing. So after that phase, there's a little bit more care put into the creation of thinking sentient races. And with that, we get the creation of the mortal races. And they are not created as we see them in story, because much time passes over the course of the history of Uluru, which is the name of the planet that all this happens on in my world. And so they are created as 4 races. One is destined to become human. They are, intellectually and mechanically adept and develop and learn quickly. You've got another race which is druidic and is built to shepherd and steward the trees and the plants, and are actually almost like plant hybrids in a way. And then you've got a third race which is melodic and aquatic, so they communicate largely via song and multi-note melodies. And then you have a fourth race which is elemental in the way it's made up. So they basically, their bodies attune exceptionally quickly to whatever element they are surrounded by. So these are going to be beings of fire, beings of ice, and things like that. These develop into the 4 main races of the mortal kindred later on, which are humans, the Leyar'ladanios, which are the aquatic beings, the Fellords or Carmorans, which are the elemental beings, depending on which region they're coming from, and then the Sprites, which are the druidic beings. And those are actually the ones that live in these areas, which I'm designing right now. So those are kind of my basic 4 races, but the reason that I took a few minutes and talked about the others is that all of them exist kind of juxtaposed over one another, and about 100,000 years of accumulated and documented history has taken place on this planet. And so there were whole ages where no human ever saw a Fellord or saw a Sprite. There were entire eras where the Sprites were the only ones on a particular continent. There was an era where the continent where all of my storytelling is taking place right now was nothing but one gigantic forest. And when magic was pulled away from the planet, the forest slowly started to die, and so the Sprites that still live there are kind of living in the last vestiges of this ancient civilization of theirs, where the humans are kind of on the up and up. And then nobody even knows what's happening underneath the waves, because it's really hard to get to the Leyar'ladanios and see what they're up to. And so that's kind of how each of those races finds themselves. And I have several different stories that I'm working on kind of intermittently throughout the entirety of that time scale. And I think that's pretty fun, because it gives me the ability to focus on different things at different times. Like the obvious old school fantasy trope is to basically tell a story about humans and have these other things in there to augment it. But I think it would be really fun at some point to write a book that is entirely from the perspective of a different fantasy race, to where you use entirely different verbiage all the time, and the reader just kind of gets acclimated, and you realize eventually that, oh, this is something different, but like I wasn't even really perceiving that, because this is just the normal for this book. That kind of stuff always seems fun to me. Just playing around with the idea of what normal is in the particular location that you're working with. So, yeah, those are kind of the 4 basic fantasy races I have. And I'm going to probably slowly introduce more over time. And the way that I've laid things out, where there were 4 original races and then they kind of diverged and matured into the ones we have today, means that I have extra wiggle room and space to bring other things in at some point if I want to. I thought it would be really cool to build in stories in my book about these old school races that are just things of myth and legend, and not to call them this, but essentially just have them be like dwarves and elves and orcs and stuff, and have it be where that is not really known if the stories are real or not, but there are tales about these beings that are essentially just orcs from thousands of years ago. I thought that would be kind of fun. A nice little homage to pretty traditional old school fantasy. And so I'm planning on doing that at some point, just having almost like mythological stories that you tell children about the era of the dwarves and the elves. And obviously, I'm not going to call them that. They're going to have their own names that they're referred to as, and they'll have some substructure of how they fit into the world. But I think that would be kind of an interesting homage to pay. But there are still remnants of the other beings. So you've got the fact that we've got four mortal races, and they're really who the story is mostly concerned with. But there are remnants of these incredibly powerful elemental beings. In fact, those elemental beings, because they take so long to mature, are often used in their infant form as elemental stones, which allow for magic to be more easily conjured and manipulated by people who are less skilled. And so there are those remnants in, almost every chapter of the writing, and it shows up frequently in discussions and stuff. And a lot of people don't know that's what they are. They don't know that this little stone that produces fire when they squeeze it hard and push their, magical or mental energy into it is actually a sentient being that is essentially just dormant at this moment. And I like that layering and how that does things. There are also still gigantic beasts that look like eldritch horrors that are chilling in the depths of the planet that are mostly slumbering because they require tremendous magical energy to be awake and to function, and most of that magical energy is just gone from the planet. But when things, when magical cataclysms rear their heads, then you have these ancient beings that all of a sudden are able to wake again. And so you often get when it rains, it pours, because, you were not being careful, and now you've managed to awaken these ancient beings, and what's that going to do? So I like that layering. But in general, most of the interactions happen between the four mortal kindreds. And at this point, the continent on which I'm, telling my story and playing is mostly humans. I think that's probably just a result of defaulting to that, and probably easiest for most people to identify with. And there are still enclaves throughout the continent of the other mortal races. And most humans don't tend to travel a ton, at least in my setting. They're born in a particular region, and the regions are large enough that, most of them don't venture out. So if you live in a bigger city where people travel, especially if you've got merchants, then you're going to see other things. And that's kind of how I played with it. The first time where my characters have run into some of the other races, especially some of the more exotic ones, is generally when they're traveling and they hit a port city, or they hit a city that happens to be on a major trade path. And then I've introduced it in a way where one of the characters will just nudge somebody else and be like, "What is that?" As a child might, and in kind of an embarrassing way. But that is kind of how I feel like that would happen a lot of the time. Maybe, if you're older, you'd be more polite about it. But essentially, humans are pretty curious. And if you saw you were walking around and all of a sudden there's something that looks like a fish person who's just hanging out over there, you're probably going to ask some questions about what's going on there. So the humans interact not terribly infrequently with the sprites, with these beings here. They have two major bastions on the continent still. A giant forest of cathedral-like trees, which you can see kind of represented here. And that's called Hyoku. And then there's another forest, which I haven't drawn in this sketchbook yet, called Tsunachi, which is basically a giant jungle. It has huge trees, kind of Yggdrasil style stuff, but it is just a giant, rainforest essentially. And because they're in those couple of locations, everybody knows where they're at. And they're reliable and consistent. People don't disbelieve that they exist or not. Everybody knows that the sprites exist. The kids tell stories about what they look like that are greatly exaggerated. The same kind of things that we would run into in our world with this kind of stuff. But most people believe they exist. And to most humans, they're held in some manner of deference because they can do things that humans can't do. They seem to be able to talk to the trees and to be able to commune with plants. And they seem to have a better understanding of the weather and how the world's functioning. And in reality, it's mostly just their skills are in different places. They have dedicated most of their developmental history and their time toward the natural world in an elven kind of fashion. And truthfully, that's where they were modeled. But they haven't put much into industry or mechanization of any kind. They're more likely to, with their longer lifespans, train plants to grow into the structure that they want to live in rather than chop a tree down and build it. And some of the tribes are not opposed to harming plants and whatnot and making them do what they want, but some of them refuse to cut any tree. And so they've had to develop society and figure out how to build structures out of things that are non-living materials, or they've had to figure out how to train the tree into the path they want to go. In fact, I think the adage that I've used is Hyoku builds and Tsunauchi trains. And you've got a much older forest where they have the time to sculpt the path of the vines and the trailing growth and make sure that, hey, in 100 years or 200 years, this will be a nice little flat that people can live on, and it'll be wonderful. And the other culture is perhaps a little bit more dedicated to having things quicker, and they're willing to make the sacrifices. And the way that they describe it is that the trees, they have an agreement with the trees, and the trees offer up a tithe of their limbs each year. So each tree offers, 5 or 10% of their healthy growth, and that way no tree is ever cut down in its entirety. And so this seems obviously really mystical and odd and interesting to the humans. And in a lot of ways, the humans hold the sprites in pretty high regard. The sprites, on the other hand, think of the humans as being a pretty dumb infant race because this was their continent originally. It's not quite like the elven stereotype of we live longer than you and we're smarter and better. It's more like an ancient resentment because at one point the entire continent was a giant forest and they were in charge of shepherding it. And basically humans did some really dumb things and tried to wrest power away from the gods and claim ultimate magic and immortality for themselves. And this led to the gods pulling magic from the planet. So it used to be incredibly easy for people to manipulate magic, and now it requires a tremendous amount of work and time investment, and it's quite difficult. And that's basically the result of a couple bad eggs among the humans. But it's easy, as unfortunately we see in reality, it's easy to take a set of interactions like that and blame it on the entirety of a race. And that's kind of what happens from the perspective of the sprites. That they have gone humans screwed this up. We used to be top dogs here, and we still would be if the humans hadn't meddled so much. And so there is some animosity there. Now, it's pretty ancient animosity, so it's not true all the time. It's not held by every single sprite. But when our characters go there are some pretty negative interactions sometimes because you do have some of the older sprites who have just had enough time to really remain stuck in their ways or to galvanize their ways and their prejudices, and it comes into effect. But the reality, too, is that the sprites have been around long enough that they have these same kind of prejudices against themselves. There are sprites who live in different locations, and because they have a tendency to live for so long and they already have a culture that allows for the resentment that's built up towards the humans, they don't have a problem eventually growing that resentment toward their own kind. And so we do see some racism and prejudice between the different races of, not even different races, different kinds of sprites. And so they don't always view everything else in the same fashion. this is something that seems to be held a little bit more heartily by the older generations. Less because the older generations have been around long enough to have seen like what the old world was, but more just they are like plants and trees. And the older they get, the more they calcify into whatever they were allowing themselves to be in their youth. So the young saplings have a tendency to be much more malleable, and they are more open to change and more open to the different races. Some of the elders think that you have to be a vegetarian if you want to truly embrace what it is to be a sprite, and some of the younger generations are like, nah, like I don't think that's true. Like we can try different things. Like octopus tastes pretty good, and so you've got these kind of divergent things. But the sprites are pretty harsh. They view themselves, their mythology teaches them that they are the original of the mortal races. It's not true, but it is what they understand to be true, and it's what they teach. And so they do have a decent amount of arrogance based on them thinking that they are the original, that they were the template. They have 6 fingers, and they were taught and have taught their children for generations that is a sign that they are touched of divinity, because the other mortal races have 5 and 4 fingers, and they have 6, and so they think that is a sign that they are, basically a higher kind. This is not strictly speaking true. It is actually a lack of understanding on their part, because the race that created them, not really race, but the god beings that created them, were beings that had 6 limbs and I think 4 fingers, but they have mistranslated over time the fact that they had 6, and that 6 is a divine number. And it still is. Real dragons have 6 limbs. They are divine. All divine beings have 6 limbs, which has led to some races actually grafting things onto their own bodies to emulate what it is to be divine, thinking, wrongly, but we are prone to these things, are we not? That, well, if I can just give myself 2 more arms or 2 more legs, then I too will be immortal. I too will be divine. And so the sprites think that they're better than everybody else. But from their own mythologies and from their own stories, that is true. And there is some truth to that and some reality to that. So they tend to think of themselves a little bit better. They also, at least the batches that I've worked with in my story, have a deep vendetta against the Carmorans, the Fellords. We can flip over there real quick. I've just been working on these guys recently, but they live in volcanoes, and we have a couple sketches here. Actually, I have a couple sketches of the sprites now that I think about it. I'm not happy with them yet, but, these are kind of the basic sketches of what the sprites look like. Not real happy with any of these. Probably happiest with this kind of silhouette here. But the Fellords are, these are the sketches I'm kind of working on with these guys here. 3 eyes, no nose, short, 4 fingers. They don't live super long, only live to be about 50 or 70 years old. They don't need to sleep, though. They just kind of work, and they are, pretty intense craftspeople. They're not the opposite of the sprites, but the sprites don't bear a whole lot of love for them. And particularly, it's because the Fellords that are still in prime existence are those of fire kind. And obviously, if you're a druidic race that worships and works with trees and things that grow, a race that basically can ignite things by just being in proximity is probably not going to be something you're going to be super stoked about. And of course, over time and with not a lot of investment into the building of relationships, there are ancestral prejudices. The interesting part here is because the Fellords are so reduced now, their race is so small on this particular continent, they're totally unaware that the sprites hold these prejudices against them, but the prejudices are very strong. I think there was probably a battle or a war many generations back between the 2 races, but it's I thought it would be a really interesting thing to explore, if you had a race that only lives to be about 50 to 70 years old, so their generations are going to go by pretty quickly by our standards, and then they are at some point in a conflict with a race that lives to be 500, 700, 1,000 years old, if all things go well, that would be really interesting to see how that would work, because, you know, it's not going to be that hard for you to hold animosity against a group of people who killed your grandparents, right? Especially in a fantasy realm where this is a whole race of people and you can be pretty prejudiced that way, you know. So that's kind of interesting. If you're like a 500-year-old sprite and like 1,000 years ago or 800 years ago, your grandfather was slain by this race, then it's not that big a deal for you to hold on to that grudge because it doesn't feel like it's been that long from your perspective. But then you go over to their perspective, and these beings are so short-lived that that is basically ancient history to them. Tolkien actually talks about this at one point when Theoden first sees the Ents, and he's like, "This is crazy! Like, how are these things stepping out of history and whatnot?" And Gandalf actually says something to him that I think is really interesting. He essentially says, like, they ignored you because all of the time that has transpired from the beginning of the Rohirrim till now is just, that's a drop in the bucket to them. Like, it's been hundreds and hundreds of years for you guys, and you guys think of it as ancient history. And yet to these guys, that barely happened. And so the Ents don't even really recognize the humans as they walk by because humans are so small and fleeting that they don't recognize them. I did a bad job of trying to articulate it, but it's a really beautiful passage right as they're leaving Helm's Deep, where Theoden kind of realizes that there are a lot of other things happening in Middle-earth that are way bigger and beyond what's happening in Rohan. And it's a kind of humbling experience for him, but I think a really cool moment. Because, you know, if you have something like Treebeard, who is somewhere in the neighborhood of 15,000 years old, I think, and then you've got, you know, Theoden, who's a king who's 60 or 70 years old and has had a pretty intense life from his perspective. Yeah, those how do those two things interact with one another? You know, Treebeard's able to remember before the wizards came. And of course, to Theoden, the story of Sauron and Gandalf has been handed down so long, it's basically legend. That when Aragorn comes in and talks about being Isildur's heir, that is, you know, the way that the Rohirrim talk about that is like legends are walking in the grass. Like, what do we even do? I mean, Éomer at one point is like, how do you even make a decision when legends spring to life and are walking through the grass? And it's really telling. But then you meet Treebeard, and it's like, this guy remembers what the world was like before the fall of Numenor, before the sword was broken, before Sauron, like, I think he remembers before Sauron even came into Middle-earth. So just like the scale of things is tremendously different. And that's kind of what's happening between these two races, is you have a race that's holding old grudges and a race that is not even sure that the reason for those grudges actually ever happened, because in their thought, it is so long ago that they're not even sure it ever really happened. So you've got these prejudices that are going kind of really different directions there. The Carmorans don't really interact with humans anymore. There was a set of wars that happened a couple hundred years ago that went really badly for them. They were betrayed. And so they have withdrawn, and for about the last 200 years, they've just, you know, not interacted with the outside world at all. But that's been long enough, fortunately, that they don't carry any of the prejudice anymore, any of the hate or resentment. They're just kind of surprised. I'm currently writing the chapters where a couple humans showed up here for the first time, and one of them had been there 200 years ago, and they actually have his arrival, like, committed to song and to story. It's been so long for them. 200 years ago is a tremendous amount of time in our world, but it's a much, much longer time when, again, you only live to be about 50 or 70 years old. They are welcoming to the humans, but they're kind of almost bewildered by them because nobody in their recollection has ever interacted with a human. Like, we have stories that we tell our children about humans, but now we see that those stories have been either greatly exaggerated or they were under exaggerative. And so it's been kind of fun to play with that. The way that I've been treating them is a pretty sincere, honest, and mature race, but also with a certain level of naivety because things are committed to legend far quicker than they would be for us. So yeah, it's been really interesting to try to figure out how to storytell a group of people that has their generations cycle that quickly, especially when they're around humans who live to be about 80 to 100. Some races of humans which live closer to the mid, 4 and 500s. A race of sprites which live to be 1,000 when all goes well. And then ancient beings that just don't die. So it's made things interesting. The fourth race is the Leyar'ladanios, which are kind of aquatic and they communicate via music. I haven't done a lot with them yet because in this book I'm not going to be telling stories wherein my characters are going underwater. That will probably happen at some point, but not in this story. So we've only bumped into a couple of the Leyar, and they just are mostly like we would think of mermaids. Like imagine mermaids actually existed here. They were pretty elusive. We've got a lot of cool stories about them, and we think they're cool and magical. And that's kind of how they are. Like, people know they exist or think they exist, but they're kind of like the thing that you just tell stories about. They're unicorns. They're cool, but nobody really understands how much of the stories about them are true or not. And as for how people think about them in a positive light, but not a realistic light, because they don't know that they actually exist. So, and they don't interact with humans frequently. They don't need to. And I haven't put a ton of time into that one yet, but I will. I have a feeling that I'm going to try to not create prejudices with them necessarily as much as just curiosities, that they simply don't understand how surface dwellers live and act. And so everything is a curiosity as opposed to a like, why can't you do this? Like, why are you so lame? It's less of a that and more of a like, what do you mean you can't do this? I think both of those aspects are pretty realistic and will be kind of fun to explore and to see how that comes out. But by and large, at the point where I'm telling my stories, most of the fantasy races are detached from one another. And so a lot of what they think about and tell as far as the stories go are just things that have been handed down over time. And some of those are accurate and realistic, and some of those, as you would imagine, are not at all. And so it's been fun to deal with. And this isn't even talking about how the non-fantasy races, like how do the different groups of humans interact from one to another, because there is a lot there. There is a lot of prejudice from human to human because they have remained separated for long periods of time too. And, we're not in this book, we're not at conflict with like orcs or something. We're in conflict with other groups of humans who have different ideas and ideals, and they're coming into conflict with one another. So, but I think we can kind of wrap this up now. We're getting a little long, and I just wanted to kind of start that conversation because several different groups of people have asked about fantasy characters and races in my world and how they interact with one another. I know I probably didn't do a good enough job in communicating that, so let me know which parts you'd like me to expand on, which parts don't make sense to you or anything like that, and I will try to address those in future sessions. As always, thanks for being here, thanks for listening, and I love reading any comments you have about your own worlds or things that you pick up on in mine. The questions often lead me down this road of contemplating and thinking about things, and so that give and take is really beneficial. Thank you to my patrons as well, who are on the screen right now. If you want to check out the Patreon, it is located in the description down below, as is a link to the Discord server. And if you do not have an artistic community, I would strongly recommend that you check out the Discord server. It is good for us as artists to have some other people of like mind to talk about all of our artistic things with. So I would encourage you to check that out. All right. Well, have a good one, y'all. See you soon.